Okay, welcome students. This is the very last topic from chapter 19. It's going to focus specifically on what we call bulk flow, which is really talking about the movement of the fluid from our capillaries into the interstitial spaces of our tissues. So fluid, let's look at the kind of the overall here, right? So this is our capillary bed. Here's our arteriole leading into the capillary bed. Here's the venule coming out of the capillary bed. Here's the lymphatics that are picking up excess fluid. And we're going to talk about here in just a second why we have that excess fluid and why we need those capillaries. So the fluid is coming in here into the capillary, so it's going to leave the capillary bed at our arterial end of the bed, right? Go out into the interstitial spaces of the tissue, but then it comes back in here at the venous end. But because of the different pressure differentials that we're going to talk about in just a second, not all of the fluid makes it back into the capillary and back into the circulatory system. It gets kind of stuck out here in the interstitial spaces, and if we didn't have that, we would end up with edema, but in order to prevent that, we have these lymphatic capillaries that kind of pick up that tissue, pick up that fluid that didn't quite make it back out. And so we kind of constantly have this mixing of fluid between the fluid that's in the plasma and then the fluid that's in our interstitial spaces. And that's really what's kind of maintaining our different ion concentrations and solute concentrations in those interstitial spaces, right? They're getting oxygen, they're putting in waste byproducts, and so that's how everything is kind of getting in and out and kind of mixing in these general areas around all these capillary beds. So bulk flow and fluid, the way fluid moves and kind of when it moves and how much it moves is dependent on two types of forces, what we call hydrostatic forces and what we call osmotic forces, specifically colloid osmotic forces. And so hydrostatic pressure is literally water pressure. It is the pressure exerted by the fluid against a wall. So blood pressure is a type of hydrostatic pressure. Think about, I can't think what they're called right now. I totally blanked on it. When you are cleaning like a house, power washers, pressure washers, right? You have to be careful when you pressure wash. When you turn up the pressure, you can knock the paint off your house if you right? That's a hydrostatic pressure. The pressure coming out of a hose is a hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressures act like a piston, right? They're going to push fluid across some sort of boundary in the body. That boundary is our plasma membrane of our blood vessels. And the main hydrostatic pressure that we talk about in our blood vessels is, of course, blood pressure. That is a hydrostatic pressure. Now, osmotic pressure has to do with, particularly due to these little, all the plasma proteins in our body, in the specific case of our blood vessels. But in a kind of generic instance, if you have some solute over here and some solute over here, but you have more of that solute over here, and the solute can't move because it's non-diffusible, it can't make it through the boundary, then the water moves via osmosis. And the water is going to move from the area of lower solute concentration to the area of higher solute concentration so that they're sort of in equilibrium. And so essentially what's going on is these non-diffusible molecules in our blood vessels, it's all of our plasma proteins like albumin, it's basically pulling it, like sucking it like a vacuum. It's pulling the water towards the area of where the major concentration of solutes are. And so we have these two types of pressures. We have hydrostatic, the pressure of the water, and we have that pushes fluid, and we have the osmotic pressure, which is kind of sucking or pulling the fluid toward the area of higher solute concentration. So two main types of forces. But we have, when we're talking about a capillary and an interstitial space of a tissue, we have two compartments that are full of fluid. And so we actually have two hydrostatic pressures. We have the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary bed that's going to force fluid out of the capillary, and we have the fluid of the surrounding interstitial fluid that is pushing fluid back into the blood vessel. We usually assume that to be zero because the lymphatics are kind of constantly draining those areas, and so the force of the fluid in the interstitial spaces doesn't have a lot of oomph behind it because it's kind of constantly getting drained. If we look at our hydrostatic pressure, our capillary blood pressure, you'll see much greater at the arterial end than it is at the venule end of the capillary bed, and that has indications on whether fluid is moving either into the capillary or out of the capillary. Again, two fluid compartments, two places where we might find some colloid proteins. So we have capillary osmotic pressure, and then the interstitial osmotic pressure. The capillary osmotic pressure is created by, again, all of those plasma proteins that are basically sucking water back into the capillary because water is going to go to that higher solute concentration. Now in the interstitial spaces, there typically aren't a lot of proteins. They tend to be more in the cells, and so the interstitial colloid osmotic pressure is quite low. And so we have these four forces that are all kind of acting on the fluids in our capillary beds. And so we can calculate now what we call a net filtration pressure. We basically look at our outward forces and our inward forces and subtract the inward forces from the outward forces. So we have the hydrostatic pressure of the capillary bed pushing out, and the osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid pulling out. We have, those are our outward forces, and then our inward forces are the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid pushing fluid in, and the osmotic pressure of the capillary bed, the osmotic pressure of the proteins kind of pulling fluid in. And so we take our outward forces, sum them up, we take our inward forces, sum them up, and calculate the inward forces from the outward forces, subtract them, and we get this net filtration pressure. And so when fluid leaves a capillary, we call that filtration. In our capillaries, that occurs at the arterial end of the capillary bed. And when fluid comes back into a capillary, we call that reabsorption, because it went out and now the capillaries are reabsorbing it. And that occurs at the venous end of a capillary bed. Again, not quite all of the fluid makes it out because so much, or makes it kind of back in to the capillary because so much of it left. And so we do need those lymphatics to kind of pick up that excess. So let's look at each end of our capillary bed. So here we are on the arterial end of the capillary bed. We have very high hydrostatic pressure of the capillary that's pushing fluid out of the capillary and into the interstitial spaces. That's one of our outward forces. And then we have the osmotic pressure of the proteins here in the interstitial spaces that are kind of sucking or pulling fluid out of the capillary and into the interstitial spaces. So we sum up those two, HPC plus OPF. Then we have the osmotic pressure of the capillary, kind of pulling fluid back in, and the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid, kind of pushing fluid back in. Again, and we sum those two up. So we take and we sum our outward forces. We sum our inward forces, subtract the inward forces from the outward forces, and we get a positive filtration, net filtration. And so filtration happens. More fluid leaves because of the higher pressures forcing it into the interstitial spaces of the tissues and out of the capillary itself. Now let's look at the venule end. Same four forces. These forces really haven't changed. The hydrostatic pressure, the osmotic pressure of the proteins kind of sucking fluid back into the capillary. We still have the same proteins, right? The hydrostatic pressure pushing fluid in, the osmotic pressure pulling fluid out. But what has changed is the hydrostatic pressure of the capillary, the blood pressure in the capillary, much, much lower. And now when we sum our outward forces and sum our inward forces and subtract them, we get a net negative filtration pressure. And so that means we're not getting filtration occurring, we're getting reabsorption occurring. And so fluid is moving out of the interstitial spaces and back into the capillary bed, where it then, of course, leaves the capillary bed and gets to circulate through the whole body again. And that is how bulk fluid flow works. It's completely based on the hydrostatic forces, the force of the water kind of pushing fluids, and the colloid osmotic pressures that are kind of pulling fluids to where they're in a higher concentration. And that is the end of chapter 19.